Welcome to Pod Hostage Diplomacy. We work to free hostages and the unjustly detained around the world. Together with their families, we share their stories and let you know how you can help bring them home.
Now, when it comes to using the family for Russia to get what they want, if that's the case, they've picked the wrong family, because I'm not going to carry water for the Russian authorities.
These are some of the most courageous and resilient people among us.
I never thought that my mother, Nahi Tagavi, will ever have a link to negotiations in Vienna about the JCPOA. That's so crazy.
People who have never given up hope.
Trevor told his girlfriend to tell me to be strong. So I'm trying to be strong for Trevor.
You know, if Trevor can cope with what he's dealing with,
exactly,
we can sure cope with the stress.
People who will never stop working to reunite their families.
We'd like to meet with the president. We believe that, he's surrounded by lots of experienced and educated advisors, but I don't believe that any of them have ever had a child taken hostage by a foreign country, especially not a superpower like Russia.
And we'll be right there by their side until their loved one comes back home.
Because if enough people care, then the right people will care enough.
I'm Darren Nair, and I've been campaigning with many of these families for years. When I first started campaigning with these families, I noticed they struggled to get the media attention they needed. So I decided to create this podcast, which is a safe space for the families to speak as long as they need to about their loved ones and what needs to be done to bring them home.
Nobody can prepare you for what our family is going through. Even if someone had told me 1 year before, in 1 year this is going to happen, prepare yourself. That's impossible.
Thank you for listening, and welcome to Pod Hostage Diplomacy. Welcome to Pod Hostage Diplomacy. Aya Hijazi is an American citizen and a humanitarian. She's the founder and director of the Bloody Foundation that works to help children in Egypt who live on the streets. In May 2014, when the crackdown on civil society in Egypt was gathering pace, Egyptian police raided the Bloody Foundation's offices and arrested Aya, her husband, and her colleagues. They were wrongfully imprisoned in Egypt for almost 3 years. Human Rights Watch called their wrongful imprisonment a travesty of justice. On 16 September 2016, Aya's family met with White House Deputy National Security Advisor Avril Haines. The following statement was released by National Security Council spokesperson at the time, Ned Price. Deputy National Security Advisor Avril Haines met today at the White House with the family of Aya Hijazi, a US-Egyptian dual citizen who was detained in Egypt while doing humanitarian work and has been held in prison for over 2 years. DNSA Haines reiterated the president's deep concern for the welfare of all American citizens held abroad and assured Hijazi's family that the United States will continue to offer her all possible consular support. The United States calls on the government of Egypt to drop all charges against Hijazi and release her from prison. Today, we have the honor of speaking to Aya herself. Aya, we're so sorry for what you, your husband, and your colleagues went through. We're so happy that you're free and back home in the United States. Thank you for taking the time to speak to us today.
Thank you, Darren. The honor is mine.
Can you please walk us through what happened?
Yeah, so I'll start around the context of what was happening in Egypt a little bit before 2014. So really quickly, of course, there was the Arab Spring, 2011, the 1 or 2 years of democracy, and then under, of course, the very unpopular, quite Muslim Brotherhood rule, and then Defense Minister Abdel Fattah al-Sisi led a coup. Of course, many wouldn't call it a coup then. And then he became president in 2014. Yes, 2014. And so this was when basically there was still a protest movement. There was a lot of freedom, but it was starting to be curtailed. There were arrests of Islamists, mostly supporters of the president, the late president, Mohamed Morsi. But I belong to what we call in Egypt the civil society, like people who are civil society and proponents of a civil state. So we don't want a military state and we don't want a religious state. And so at that time of 2014, there were really no people from the people I represent, or I'm part of the civil state, like there were no people arrested. But it was very clear that democracy wasn't going anywhere. So it was at that time that I not only decided, because I had started my foundation Biladi a little bit before that, but this is when I gave all of my focus to Biladi, to a nonprofit, to something very apolitical, oddly enough. That wasn't really like, we weren't doing any criticism of the regime. We really wanted to do good and keep movement going, but without criticism. So this was the context. So we were doing like various projects. The one that was mostly known was the Street Children, but we've also done like various dialogues. We've also done like some garbage cleanup in slums. So on May 1st, like there was actually like no expectation that we'd have any confrontation with the authorities. Actually, like quite contrary. We've had, like, I've spoken to the police twice, and one time, like, they were seeing me with children, and they were like, "What is this?" So I invited them upstairs to see the children, and they commended the work, and they're like, "Great work." So I had no expectation of what was going to happen. Although I must say that, like, people always warn that there's the police use street children as thugs, so like this is not a project you want to approach. So on that May 1st, I was out with my husband then, and then we received a call from one of the Biladi members that a group of what they called thugs came and attacked the place, claiming that they're looking for a child. So to explain what would happen, like a lot of these children are runaways, and a lot of times like parents come looking for them. So our protocol at Biladi was, when parents come, we first meet with the parents and like we engage them, and then we ask the children to also meet with the parents and try to work out an agreement with them, whether it's better for them to return to the parents or to stay with us. And we've had and then I think 3 or 4 encounters where one time we were the ones who took the child to his parents' home. The others, like the children, would go back and forth between us and their parents. So this was a first where where the supposed family came with not batons but sticks, and they actually intimidated people, the volunteers and members of Biladi, but also the children. They broke one of their glasses. And struck one at the head. And so this was surprising. We haven't known, we didn't know the child. No one even knew. Because, people or children living in the street, they know each other. No one has heard of that child. So what happened then was my husband went with the family and took them to the police station, supposedly to file a complaint that they have attacked Biladi. He told me not to go upstairs to the nonprofit, but of course I couldn't leave the children behind, so I went, and we were just waiting to see what will happen. So 2 hours later, the police came and they took all the children and then me to the police station, and it wasn't really interrogation. We were faced with the parents. And it seemed that first night, it was a regular questioning of, who's right, whose story is right. But then the second day, they were bringing, we weren't in handcuffs. We weren't even in a cell. We didn't sleep in a cell. We slept just on a sofa, supposedly not being arrested. So that, we were going back and forth, being questioned. Until the next day, I was just expecting to meet the chief investigator of that police department, and instead it was an officer from National Security. And this is when he started hurling insults, and this is when the episode of beating happened. And he was saying "Oh, you American spy! America pays you to do this, to take children to protests. Why do you do this, you traitor?" and this is where it was where it became clear to me that it was something political. Like the only sign or indicator before that is that when the police came to the nonprofit, they're like, "Show us your Canadian passport." I'm like, Canadian. Obviously, I wasn't Canadian, but they were trying to let me say, obviously, my American. And so, at that encounter with the national security officer, he's like, "America won't come for you," and then he just stomped on my American passport. I hadn't even like said anything about America or called for America's help. But then, then what happened was they took my husband separately and they told him to admit that I was a spy and that I used like weird recording equipment. And if he just testifies, he would be a witness and nothing would happen further. And he was tortured and electrocuted for that. But he refused. So they told him, like, okay, you think you can defy us? So as a punishment, neither you or her will ever see the day of light again. And then they gave us this these criminal charges, not related to espionage or anything. Like, I'm saying criminal as opposed to political. So that it was really frightening charges. We were charged with human trafficking, with preparing porn materials, I think, from the kids and then letting them watch porn and exploiting them sexually, just really hideous charges that even no lawyer would want to intervene, and the U.S. government wouldn't want to intervene. And that was what the U.S. government would say at the beginning when my family would talk to them. They're like, no, this isn't political. This is clearly a criminal case.
I'm so sorry to hear that. I mean, that was obviously their intention, to make you look guilty and use the state media to kind of tarnish your reputations. And you see that with lots of countries that practice hostage diplomacy or take political prisoners, countries like Iran, Venezuela, and Russia, and China. So what were the conditions of your detention itself? Were you held in solitary confinement, or were you held in a cell with many other prisoners?
So I was really almost treated like any other non-political prisoner. So besides that episode of assault, I was just I went to the police. Normally, prisoners or people in detention, they go to the police station and then they'd be transferred. There isn't really one set criteria of when or how they transferred to prison. So I was held in a regular cell. Of course, I was supposed to be held in a cell that was underground and it had no ventilation. It had just roaches flying around it. Thank God it wasn't they decided to transfer us to another cell. Just how the arrangement was. And so the cells are underground. It had some light. But there's it's very small. It fits only, I think it fits 4 people or 5. Sometimes we'd be 7 people. That we couldn't all sleep at once at night. So we'd exchange, it's turns. We do turns. Some people would stay awake while others sleep. When the cell was had more people, of course, they wouldn't give you food, so you had to depend entirely on what your family bring you. And there was no exercise in police stations, no beds, obviously, or anything like that. But this is what police stations are like in Egypt. A lot of people die in police stations because of no medical care, no exercise, no sunlight. And then I was transferred 12 days later. I was transferred to prison. In prison, it is, of course, there's all the problems with prisons, overcrowding, not enough bathrooms. Also, there is food, but it's inadequate. So you almost entirely depend on what your family bring you in money wise and food and personal items wise. But it was slightly better. There was sunlight at least, which was very important, of course, and exercise. After pre-trial, interestingly enough, pre-trial detainees, they're supposed to be innocent. as opposed to like legally innocent, but they received kind of a worse treatment. So like I wasn't allowed outside exercise in my pre-trial detention cell before, but then like actually the police, like the chief inspector of the like basically of the prison, he was nice enough and he transferred me to another ward, which was the sentenced ward, and it was actually oddly enough better than the pre-trial detention ward.
Did you have any medical conditions at the time? And if so, were you given the medical care you needed? Because I know you just said like if they're being held at the police station, they don't get any medical care, which is why that's where detainees tend to die. But when you were held in prison, did you have any medical conditions, or even either pre-existing or as a result of the detention itself? And if so, were you allowed to, go to the infirmary or see the doctor or get any kind of medical care?
Yeah, medical care is really, really terrible. So yeah, I got sick twice. One time I was having like a problem with my wisdom teeth, and I get all these infections, and like they wouldn't even. Like the hospital doesn't have the right amounts of antibiotics. And so if you have money, you could send through the hospital for outside medication, but it takes like 2 weeks, up to 2 weeks to get the medication you want. And like, I just suffered miserably. The second time was I am asthmatic, and there's so much smoking in the cells. And there's nothing you could do about it. There's no like non-smoking areas. So while they would get me on the, what is it called? the ventilator or whatever, but like it wouldn't, I still couldn't breathe. So like I ended up staying at the cell's door, like spending nights over at the cell's door trying to gasp for air, until some people like gave me actually antihistamines. I didn't know what they were, but they're like, this would work for you. And without the doctor's prescription, and they did. So I had to like send for my mom, and then wait for another month to actually get almost a month to get the medication. And I had to do negotiations like, no, please, I need more than I need more than just like one pack. So it was it was a lot of suffering at the end. And yeah, I think if I stayed, like this was towards the end where, of course, the stress of awaiting the judgment really augments the stress on the body. And so I think if I were sentenced, like I may have really, really suffered miserably from my asthma.
Again, we're so sorry to hear that. You are an American citizen. Sorry. Did you receive consular support from the US government? Because I know you said they publicly didn't want to say anything about your case. They said this is a criminal case, not a political one. At least that's what they said initially. But were you able to see anyone from the US Embassy? Do you get the consular support you are entitled to as an American citizen?
Yeah, so I don't know legally what consular supports gives, but I was like the U.S. Embassy would visit. I don't know, like once a month or something. Like they would just ask if I have access to food, if I'm being tortured or not, and that's it. So at one point, I'm like, all right, this is not useful, and I told them not to come. Like it was, I was really unhappy with them. Like, for example, when the advocacy on my behalf started and there was interest in the State Department, they kept saying, oh, but you didn't give us the signature. Then they lost the signature, like my consent form that the U.S. advocate on my behalf. And then at one point they said, oh, America's now advocating on your behalf. We were really surprised. Like it's like, it's not expected to do that. So where I knew that it was expected to do that. And then like towards the very end, when there was a lot of coverage of my case, like they did two things. First, like I wasn't able to see my husband except when we go to court, and sometimes this wouldn't happen 6 months at a time. So they brought my husband for a visit, and then like they got me permission to treat my teeth in an outside hospital. So this only happened once I was under the spotlight.
So you're saying the United States government only decided to do more once there was media coverage of your case, not before?
Yes. No, not before. Like I had so I think I saw my husband, he visited in October 2016. We were arrested in May 2014. So yeah. And then like also this was like visiting my husband came with the papers for my teeth, and I've suffered from my teeth before. So like it was very clear that they would do the least that they can do.
Were you given access to a lawyer?
So yeah, we had our own lawyer. Like the embassy does not give lawyers. Like all that they could do is recommend lawyers. So we had our own lawyers.
And I understand from previous interviews that you've given and articles when we did the research on your case is that you were not allowed to speak to your lawyer privately. Is that true?
Yeah, that's true. And especially, so this is not really answering that question only, but it's another thing. Like when it comes to my treatment as an American, like in some ways I got a better treatment, and in some ways I got a worse treatment. So because of my case, and because it was an American case and a political case, like they really, really monitored all of my correspondences very, very closely, whether they were letters, whether they were books, or even visits from lawyers. So when the lawyers would come, they would send someone actually to listen in.
What was your defense like? I mean, was your lawyer allowed to give you an appropriate defense? Or did they do things like what the Iranian judiciary would do? Would be like they would give you access to the case file at the very last minute, like a few hours before you go to court, or not give you access to the case file, not give you access to the case file at all? Or was your lawyer able to get all the information he or she needed and see you as often as required? Because I know obviously he or she couldn't speak to you privately, but did they actively do things to prevent your lawyer from giving you an appropriate defense?
Yeah, so with that, no, like they actually gave us the right for defense. And also in here, it would be helpful to shed some context on what Egypt has been doing. So like in 2013, as I mentioned, like it started cracking down only on Islamists. And then in 2014, I was the first like from the civil society and civil state. And then it started cracking down on others, and also like observing the laws that also deteriorated. It started with observing the laws and giving like lawyers access. And now like it wouldn't even, now things have been shifting where the courts wouldn't allow lawyers even like to photocopy case files. They just have like give them an hour or so to read them, and photocopying would be at exorbitant prices like 10,000 or 20,000 pounds per case. But in my case, they were able to get the documents they needed.
What were the court hearings themselves like? Were these fair trials in your opinion, or were these sham trials?
Yeah, it's 100% sham trials. At the the first 2.5 years, they weren't even court hearings. They would call them like just detention renewals. They wouldn't even listen substantively. So there is a law in Egypt that says pretrial detention is limited to 2 years. That law is not observed at all. And by the way, worst of all, like the American embassy tried to say that the law isn't 2 years. Like if you're interested, I could explain what the law is and what the American embassy is saying. So the law says it's 2 years, but then during Sisi, sometime I think during my imprisonment, it was amended that if you are in retrial, meaning that you've already been sentenced, but then you are in retrial, then pretrial detention could be extended to beyond 2 years. The American embassy was trying to say that no, it's not it's not if you are in retrial, like they have the right to imprison you indefinitely, basically indefinitely in pretrial detention. So anyway, here I am digressing. Yeah. So anyway, so that's one part of like not observing the law. Like the first 2.5 years, basically until probably September or October, is that when I started actually having a trial. Like they were just, the presiding judge, like he is even called, and it's a he, Audit Tegdidat, which means like the renewal judge. Like all he do is renew, like without looking substantively. And like sometimes when the lawyers would try to talk, they wouldn't let them. when we tried to talk, like they would just dismiss us. And even this, like in my case, like when we actually had the trial and the lawyers delivered their defenses, like I started giving my defense, and then like the judge midway is like, all right, that's enough. So there was that. And also, like, yeah, for the 2.5 years, the judges would go on a judge's holiday for almost 6 months at a time. It's not official, but it's at the time of like from May to November. This is when I know, like when May comes, I'm not going to go to court for 6 months. Like they do the administrative renewal without the judges going. They go for Ramadan break, the 2 holidays break, and for the summer break. And this is like a 6 months period. Of course, like the actual trial itself, which started in September, October, like it's on paper, it looked like a real trial where they would let observers in. But of course, we knew the judgment, of course, was political.
So just to take a step back and give our listeners a better understanding of why this happened to you. Obviously, you've given us some good background at the beginning before you were arrested. But can you tell us more about your background itself? Because we know you grew up in the US, you went to Egypt, you met your husband in Tahrir Square, and you established the Bloody Foundation with what I understand was the money that you and your husband had saved away for your wedding. Can you just tell us a bit? Obviously, that was an amazing thing for you and your husband to do. And thank you for doing that. But could you just give us a bit more background on the earlier years of your life? And when I say that, I know you're still quite young, you're in your 30s. But can you just tell us a bit more about your background?
Mid-30s, almost 40 now. So my background was between mostly actually not Egypt, but Saudi Arabia and the US. My parents have met in the US. They were both doing their masters. And then my dad found like a good job opportunity in Saudi Arabia, and that's where they moved, and that's where they had me. And I grew up most of my, the first 12 years, most of them were spent in Saudi Arabia then. We would just go to the US in the summer, like we had some family there. And then at 12, I moved to the US, and then did most of middle school. In high school, like the last year of high school was in Egypt. And then I started law school in Egypt, but then I came back midway and did a conflict resolution BA degree in here, Northern Virginia, George Mason. That's where I spent my years in the US, Northern Virginia. And then I started doing law school, the JD degree. In Egypt, it's undergrad. Here, it's, of course, a JD. I finished my first year, and this was when the Arab Spring happened. And this is when I decided to go to Egypt, hoping that we'd have really a democracy and a state that observes human rights in a nutshell.
Can you tell us about establishing the Bloody Foundation itself and the amazing work that you've been doing?
So it came, of course, it came in that context of the Arab Spring. And this is why I think, of course, people would ask me, why were you arrested? Why were you the one who was targeted? So I don't have an answer for that, but like it's I think many different pieces. So one piece of it was obviously that I was, pro the Arab Spring. I was doing protests, but like as I explained a little bit in the when I was giving context, that it became very clear. Like I have never seen Egypt so polarized between like Islamists, pro-military, pro-old regime, and pro-revolution. And it was very clear that it was going the dictatorship way. And I thought, like, no, we must have a way beyond polarization and away from politics where we could, like, do organizing and community engagement. And, like, in Egypt, we still didn't have a huge, like, do-it-yourself, like, start a nonprofit, do a startup. We didn't have that because the atmosphere wouldn't allow it. So I think, like, during those few years, like between 2011 and 2014, the nonprofits bloomed from like 9,000 nonprofits to 45,000 nonprofits. So it was a time of like people wanting to take control of their destiny, of wanting to do something different. and believing that they can. And so I felt like citizen engagement to a big extent has been protesting and asking the government for solutions. And I wanted us to do, I'm like, yes, of course, the government is a failure in so many ways. And of course, the government is a solution in so many ways, but we, like the people, also can offer a lot of solutions. And so for me, it was like there was that deeper purpose of being engaged, not only in like asking or in protesting, but also in doing, and training, like doing trainings to let people, do project design and project implementation. And so we chose like the most problems that people really, really suffer from. And have you been to Egypt before?
No, I have not been to Egypt. As you know, I used to be the director on the board of Amnesty International UK, and I don't think I would probably be arrested the moment I arrive.
Well, they'd probably return you and be like, "Don't come to Egypt again." So like the first thing that strikes you when you go to Egypt, a lot of people who don't know Egypt will think the pharaonic civilization and whatnot. But the first thing that strikes you in Egypt is poverty, and like poverty really by seeing how downtrodden people are, and like it just strikes you in the face of how they look and how ragged the clothes are, and sometimes like even dirt accumulating. But also then later it started with garbage being in the streets. Like even in more upper scale neighborhoods, there have been like garbage dumps in the streets, and it's I could go at length explaining why. Of course, all related to corruption. And so we're like, what are some problems that society suffers from, and how can we engage, and how can we bridge, like bring people together? And in Biladi, we had people who are pro military rule, we had people anti, like, so it was a way of uniting people. So we found that garbage, and we really did some great work. People like, I do remember like one time when we told people that we're going to clean up your place, like they did the trilling, like the Egyptian, like really, really happy that just someone's going to clean up their garbage dumps. And then there was, of course, the street children. They were like, they are, I guess, the most abused and forgotten. And of course, it's not only a problem in Egypt. People really despise them and treat them really badly. And of course, like they start their lives at the streets and out of poverty. But then they slowly become criminals, as of course they'd only steal, and then like they'd be involved in fights, and then of course there's rape, and then they become rapists and all of that. And so I thought that we could do a lot, we could offer them a lot. And the truth is that we did, and people were really, really excited about that project. Like we went on radio and we went on TV. And at one point, it was a very like popular youth radio program. Like we've had just hundreds of people wanting to volunteer, and they were really excited about the project. Like people would come and spend time with them and watch movies with them. And at one point, I brought 3 of the kids to the AUC, to the American University in Cairo. And they were like really dressed nicely, and they were really adorable. Like you wouldn't say that they were street kids. And they really know how to melt your hearts. They're just adorable kids. And then the professor, like at the end of the meeting, she's like, every one of my students has changed their minds about street children. Like, you just view them as this nuisance, as these criminals to be taken care of. But then once you engage with them, you really understand their problem. And so it was like, I've done a lot of work in different areas. I've been to the White House. I've been in prison. But like the happiest time in my life was really when I worked with them, and I just saw them, like the human touch of how, like I had a rule that they're not allowed to call me mom. But then at the end, of course, they ended up calling me mom, and I didn't stop it. They were very protective of me and of the people who worked with them. And like we've had a lot of honest conversations of why society disdains them. They even say like, why would people spit on us? And of course, like while I didn't condone like why people would spit. Like I tried to explain how they are portrayed to society, and we were doing like a lot of advances with them. One of the street children would go to school and take his exams while living on the street. And he was there because his father didn't want. That's another problem, like with a lot of the lower class, like the fathers didn't want them to continue school, and they would take them to work, like, what do you call it? Not interns, but, in training with mechanics and things like that. And they're really abused and beaten. So like, that's one reason why some of them would run away. So we were starting to take them back to school and giving them lessons. It was beautiful. And to this day, like, people would write to me, they'd be like, we were so encouraged by what you were doing. We wish we could do a project like that. But unfortunately, because of your story, we would never approach that topic.
I mean, it sounds like amazing work you've been doing. And I'm sure there are many of our listeners who agree and would like to help. So you're still the director of the Bloody Foundation. And the Bloody Foundation is still doing amazing work. How can our listeners help the Bloody Foundation right now if they want to?
So I'm still the director of the Bloody Foundation, yet legally and in terms of projects, it's a different Biladi. It was an Egyptian Biladi then, now it is an American Biladi. We no longer do any field work like this because that is really strictly not allowed and dangerous. We do actually defense of political prisoners. And, while I told you, like, it was the most vulnerable group that we found back then, like in 2012 and 2014 was street children. Now there's children who are arrested for political reasons, and they are tortured nonetheless. And they are really, they are abused nonetheless. So we defend children and women who are in prison for political reasons, and sometimes also freedom of expression. Like, there are girls and women who are in prison, like, and have up to 10-year sentences for TikTok. I don't know if you've heard about them, for like just, doing what girls do on TikTok. So there's a lot of, I'd really encourage listeners to take a look at what's happening in Egypt, to take a look at the repression that's happening in Egypt, and whatever way that they can, like, not support. The U.S. is a close ally of Egypt, but turns a blind eye into all the abuses that happen. They try to smear all the political prisoners as terrorists. They are not terrorists. They're people like me. Of course, we do have a terrorism problem, like, to be clear about it. And there are, of course, terrorists like there are anywhere. But most of the political prisoners are just regular people who are trying to make Egypt a better place. So they could, there's a lot of influence, a room for influence of U.S. policy or whatever European policy towards Egypt, of raising the profile of political prisoners, of exposing the repression that has been happening. And of course, the military aid that is sent to Egypt. The U.S. does certify every year that there's progress in human rights, and there's absolutely no progress in human rights, but manifest deterioration. So there is no reason to give that waiver that the U.S. continues to give.
So if I wanted to find out more about the Bloody Foundation itself and what you currently do, what would be the best way to get in touch? As in, what's your website address?
So the website is Biladi, BELADY-IH.org. We have Facebook pages, and we have this Egypt Prison Atlas page that gives a lot of information about women and child political prisoners, like who they are, what their stories is, what their sentences are. It gives a profile of the judges, the terrorism circuit judges, and what their judgments are, like, including the death sentences. So it's really, if someone wants, it's like a map of the repression in Egypt pertaining to women and children.
Oh, we recommend our listeners check it out. Again, thank you for all the work you're doing. Now, going back to your own experience in prison. So during the almost 3 years you were held in prison, you were able to learn French, Spanish, and how to draw. So did you do this to keep yourself busy? And why did you learn these?
So yes, a little bit or a lot of, I'm like still not confident about my Spanish and French. So drawing, I was learning it before prison. I just had some more time to draw. And yeah, I had a schedule in prison to feel like I was, a prisoner feels useless. Like after you've been contributing to society and to your family, like you are not contributing to anyone. So this is, I guess, my theory was this is the time where if I can't contribute to the outside world, I could contribute to my own growth and also to my sanity, because it's very hard to stay sane. Not only in prison, but in prison, not knowing what will happen to you. And that is, of course, like the biggest toll on any prisoner's mind and sanity. And so the way to stay sane was for like self-improvement. And also like I wanted to learn languages before. Of course, in the US, Spanish is super useful. In the Middle East and a lot of the world, like French is useful. But also, like I had a schedule of what to read, and like novels were what I would read on our holiday Friday, so that I could have some escape, like a mental escape.
So you were released in April 2017 after you were arrested in May 2014. Can you tell us more about the events leading up to your release?
All right. So as you've mentioned, in September, I think when Nat Price gave that statement. So there was also like I would like to credit the U.S. is ultimately 100% credited for my release, but I would also like to credit the Egyptian nonprofits and the international human rights organizations, of course, like Human Rights and Amnesty and Human Rights First. So there's been like really the at first, like the first year and a half of my arrest, no news agency in Egypt was allowed to publish about me. But then, like after the case was forgotten a little bit, apparently, like Egyptian newspapers, especially the dissent ones that were still like dissent newspapers, they were allowed to publish. And so this is when my like advocacy for me and my case started gaining traction. When Egyptian nonprofits were able to publish in like dissent newspapers in Egypt, and then convince international human rights organizations to publish and say that I'm not a criminal. And then like the Washington Post picked this up, and then like they, as I told you in our private meeting, when my Congressman Don Beyer and our neighbor Congressman Conley, when they did a press conference and called for my release, encouraging senators to write a statement to the State Department. So this was all like the outside, what was happening on the outside international end. On the more like private end, the Egyptian government, of course, like they didn't tell me why I was arrested, like really arrested, or what they really wanted from me. But they made it clear. It was in April, so just like 2 weeks before the arrest, that the director of the Egyptian intelligence sent my lawyer with an offer of relinquishing my Egyptian citizenship, and then walking free without trial. This was the offer. The reason is like they wanna smear like activists and just show that they're, all of their loyalty is to whatever other country that they belong to, mostly to the US. And so then I refused. I said I will not give up my citizenship. And so the lawyer came again not with a counter offer, but saying like more of a threat that if I don't give up my citizenship, like, it could be a life sentence. They didn't say what the dealings were with President Trump were at the time. So I went to court, or to trial rather, knowing that I was very well at risk of having a life sentence. And especially that the Trump White House or administration hadn't, I haven't heard any statements from them. So it was, a lot of people thought that, President Trump would not advocate for a Muslim, also Arab political prisoner, or even like strained ties with Egypt. So it was a time. So at that time, like I had a fear that my imprisonment would have to that I would be delayed until like the next Democratic president.
So, can you talk to us about the day of your release itself? Because I know I've seen some of the other interviews you did. I know I saw the moment the judge announced things, and I saw you and your husband and everyone else cheering in the cell. But like, can you just talk to us? What was it like in that moment when you were there and you found out?
So yeah, okay. The day of the release is different from the day of the acquittal. Not sure what the procedures are like in the U.S., but in Egypt you're not released when you're acquitted. Like the paperwork may take days, weeks, or months even. So on that April 16th, I went to court. I was bracing for a life sentence. Like even the lawyers then would be like, oh, it could be 25, 15, like the best we could hope for is 7. So I was like hoping and praying that not to cry or faint. I don't like to appear weak. And so I was just mentally prepared. I was truly hoping for an acquittal, because I know it matters to people. But I wasn't expecting it. And so when the judge, the way judgments are read, like they usually, like if there's a case with several people, they would start with the highest, the longest sentence or the most severe sentence. So he read my husband's name. I'm like, oh God, he got the longest sentence. And then he said my name. I'm like, I'm just like him. And then he started going through the others. I'm like, no way he'd bring like those two people, like no way he'd give them long sentences. And until he read the list, I'm like, what's happening there? Then, and he said acquittal. And I was incredulous. I couldn't believe it. And so I was, of course, elated and thinking that of course, it's a huge victory, moral and psychological and everything. But I also, like, at that time, I was basically the hero of Egypt, and newspapers were like, oh, she's innocent. I still, I'm very distrustful of the authorities. So I went to prison, and then I waited for the news to hear it. Like maybe they changed their minds. And then I also waited the next day to read it in the newspapers, that nothing would change. So this was the acquittal, which was quite different from the release. So
how long did it take until you were actually released?
So the release happened rather quickly. It was, I believe, Sunday, the acquittal. And then Monday, if I remember correct, Monday was the Egypt, what he calls Easter. And Tuesday at 11 o'clock, I was called to be released. And this is where I didn't know what to expect. I just honestly thought that one of two scenarios, either my family would be waiting for me outside the prison gate. This is in the abnormal circumstances, because prisoners generally or normally tend to go from prison to the police station that they were first held at, and then be processed from the police station. First at a central police station, and then to their own police stations, I believe. So I thought that I might be taken to that police station, or I'd find my family outside, but I didn't find either. There was the armed forces SUVs waiting. And of course I knew I had to go with them. I had no idea who they were or what was going to happen. And this is when I asked and they wouldn't answer. But so El Qanater prison is 2 hours outside of Cairo. So the 2-hour trip, at the end of the 2-hour trip, I was taken to the director of national intelligence himself. And this is where I had no idea what he wanted to say. And this is where he said that I had to meet President Trump. So at the time, the design was that me and my husband would go and meet with the president. My husband wasn't released yet. I was the only one released from the 7 people held with us. And so he basically wanted to guarantee that I and my husband would agree. Else, as he threatened, my husband could stay in prison a little bit longer. Of course, we all know what a little bit longer was. A life sentence longer.
So just to understand, you meeting the director of intelligence of Egypt, right?
Yes.
So the director of intelligence of Egypt is forcing you to have a meeting with President Trump of the United States.
Yes.
Why? Why does he care about what you do in the US?
Why does he care? Of course, he wouldn't say. Whatever lame reason he gave was, you owe him a thank you. Obviously, that's not what he wanted. So to me, I think what the U.S. government got, and of course, like, I didn't want that meeting with President Trump. Let's not make it overtly political, but I didn't want that meeting with President Trump. But of course, like, so I think President Trump was a big winner in that meeting. Of course, so it was, he came to office January 25th. This was April 16th. So he was able to boast amply about it, that he released a political prisoner whom Obama has failed to release. And so, like, he really bragged about it for a few months. So he got that foot off. Whereas like the win for President Sisi of my release was that he was able, all of this, like, is conjecture, obviously. But Obama would never meet with President Sisi. Hillary Clinton, like, said that when we thought she might win, she said she wouldn't meet with Sisi unless he releases me. And so President Trump met with Sisi like just 3 weeks before my release, and like everyone made it clear to me that was the condition. Like, if you guarantee that she'll be released, we will meet you. What the Egyptian government gained from my meeting with President Trump is what they did following that. All the state media confirmed that I was an American spy, and so yeah, that's their win.
So it seems to me that the US government negotiated your release not because it was the right thing to do, because there was a political gain for both leaders for the Egyptian president and the US president. It wasn't because it was the right thing to do. So
this is a little bit complicated. So obviously the first 2 years they didn't do it because it was the right thing to do. My also analysis and conjecture is like, the Egypt is an ally. Why strain the relationship with it? It's not worth it. Even if like there's this one citizen, it's really not worth it. But then, like, when pressure was mounting through the local and international nonprofits and the media, and when like US officials would be asked by media, like, why is she in prison? They were being responsive, and this was then like still the Obama administration, like they were being responsive to the people. And so why they started intervening was, I think, because they were being accountable to the people or the media asking people to intervene. And so this was kind of the right thing to do. I don't know how Obama would have handled it. Like, it's like, advocacy. Like, I also like to be fair in crediting the administrations their due. So like the advocacy heightened at the end of the Obama term. I don't know how Obama would have handled it, if he would have forced a meeting like that. I don't think he would have. So I think like the administrations at that time, as I said, like even Hillary Clinton was talking about it, like they were going to do it because this was a case where like they were being questioned about it. And so with Trump, like he since he was also being questioned about it, it's like, how do I get him an additional win, I suppose. I mean, that's just sad to hear, but it's not surprising. Sad, but not surprising. So Aya, you're clearly a strong and resilient person. How did you cope with the trauma during your imprisonment itself? As in, how did you find the strength? So, I'd like to say that like my year out of prison was way harder than my 3 years in prison. I was kind of prepared for imprisonment while I was protesting. I wasn't prepared for being in prison for the nonprofit work I was doing. And so, first of all, like I felt that I was doing something, contributing to society. And I also had a list of things that I would be grateful for if I had them in prison, like sunlight, as I made clear, exercise, access to books, access to letters, and family visits. So like it was more, I expected prison to be much worse. So like I also expected, I was okay before I went to prison with spending 5 years in prison with not feeling bitter about it. But of course there were like other things that made it bitter, like not knowing how long I'll spend, of being charged with these really heinous crimes. of being forgotten totally. It was a mix of like having really, really low moments where I give up and think that I'll never be released again, and also, suicidal. But then there were other moments, especially I have to say, when there was like support from people, like when they'd send me letters, or I know there's advocacy. But even then, I guess I came to terms with it, where I asked myself, like, what have I done wrong? Like, really, I haven't done nothing wrong. Like, I tried to do something, even like I do believe political engagement is our right, but it wasn't even then. Like, I was doing something safe and something that would benefit society, and so there's no regrets. Like, I just have to come to terms with it, and this is when I've had some peace. Of course, like, I've done a lot of meditation. And then I got access to radio after 6 months, like, all these additional things like reading, novels, meditation, radio, music, like they're techniques and tools that would really take the strain of thinking about what's happening. And like most of my days, like the worst day for me was when I'd hear that I'll get 6 months. 6 months, is a criminal sentence. Without going to court, without the hope of the release. And like, this is when these were usually my low moments, but the highest moments, of course, were the opposite, when I was going to court and thinking that I might be released. But usually, like, my days, starting with exercise and then, of course, my study schedule, and then like listening to the BBC at 3 p.m. My days were mostly pleasant, and I was interacting with my colleagues and learning about crime and the social structures. And so there was I tried to gain a lot, and I did a lot of learning, like both about life and society, and of course books.
So there's a saying that goes, tough times don't last, tough people do. Do you have recommendations for other hostages and their loved ones on how to cope and persevere through trauma?
Yeah, well, the first is psychological care. I couldn't emphasize more the role of psychological care, which is so neglected within, I guess, in this context, the hostage community, but also with the prisoners community, the family, and even organizations who support them. It is invaluable. Even, of course, the family and the hostage or the prisoner themselves, they'd want to be released and think if we're released, everything would be solved. And that's true in a sense, but it's also not true in a sense. I was talking to, at Biladi, we do provide psychological care. And I was talking to the psychologist, debriefing her sessions with current and former prisoners. And she's like, some of the prisoners, they don't feel that they have left prison after that they have left prison. Prison stays with the person, I suppose, forever. And so while the ultimate goal, I guess, in hostage diplomacy or with political prisoners is to get the prisoner released, the psychological trauma will not stop. And so this is more just kind of encouragement for a person, if somehow they could get access to care or reading about psychotherapy, for the family to get that psychological care for themselves as they are suffering, but also to deal with the person after they're released. The trauma will not go. And then besides that, getting used to life again is very difficult. Engaging with people and with your loved ones is difficult. And sometimes family members, out of goodwill, they make it even more difficult. So that's the first. Of course, religion and spirituality, that also played a role that I neglected to mention. I was very spiritual in prison. And then third of all, of course, there's the engagement, and always which is really tied to hope. Sometimes there's unfortunate results where people don't get out, but it's crucial for everyone's well-being to retain hope. And part of retaining hope is, continuing to engage, even if it seems far-fetched, even if release seems far-fetched. Nothing is impossible. I think it was quite impossible for me, like, to actually think that I would end up at the White House, but it happens. Like, I wasn't this superstar. It wasn't like this, this world-renowned basketball player or whatnot. And so, and like my friends who helped in advocacy, like, when they talk to congressmen, like my friend would say, Chelsea, she's also like one of the people credited for my release. Like, she would call and then they'd hang up, and like she'd say they'd close one door and I'd open another. So like, just to maintain that engagement and maintain hope, and hopefully, good things would follow.
Thank you for that. I'm sure the families with loved ones currently held hostage abroad and former hostages will find that helpful. Now, we know you're a mother, so congratulations. How is life? I mean, what are you up to now?
With motherhood or with what?
In general, because I know it's been 5 years since your release. Obviously, you said the first year after your release, it was difficult. You're recovering from the trauma. It's been 5 years now. I interviewed Michael Scott Moore, this German-American journalist. He was held hostage by Somali pirates for 977 days. I interviewed him in March. It's been 7 years since he was released. And he comes across a pretty chilled out guy. He lives in Los Angeles. He's a surfer. If you follow him on social media, you'd never realize that this is a guy who was held hostage for almost 1,000 days at gunpoint by Somali pirates. But 7 years later, he's still no one, I guess nobody fully recovers. He still gets panic attacks every now and then. Like, it's 5 years since you've been released. You're a mother. What would you say you're like now? Are you fully recovered, or are there still some kind of leftovers from that trauma? I mean.
Yeah, I think for my case, it's a little bit different because while I was a hostage, I was also classified as a political prisoner. And so, so first of all, like, I've left so many political prisoners behind, and every day, working on the file of women and children arrested for political reasons is not easy. And it's trauma on its own. You're unable to secure the release of so many, and of just like following the news of not only Egypt but the Arab Spring and beyond that, it's like the wave of the right-wing dictatorial governments. Like, it's its own trauma of, like, part of the 1 year that the 1 year trauma wasn't that I was spent 3 years in prison. It was more of like, what am I doing in my life? What's the purpose now? And so I'm still trying, like, okay, now the Arab Spring is gone, and I'm working on this file. Like, what is going to keep me going, and what should we look forward to? What is, when you have all those big dreams and now you just have to reduce them. So I think that's where I am. But my daughter, like, she's really the best thing that has happened. And she's a really jolly little child, and she keeps me going. And I guess one more thing to fight for. Sometimes I do feel like, why have I brought a human being to this world? But she's happy, and I, like, there's more reason to fight to make this world a better place.
I'm glad that you're hopeful, and that you've come up from this not as the victim but as a victor in some way. Which is, I mean, it gives other families hope that, things will get better. So thank you for that. Now we're reaching the kind of how to make things better part of our podcast conversation. So what should the Egyptian government be doing better?
Oh, to start with, so much. But to start with, like, to release the political prisoners, number one. Number two, to stop torture. Number three, to stop enforced disappearances. That's one horrible thing that happens. Now, most of political prisoners in their journeys, they're disappeared for various periods of time, like lasting from 48 hours to undefined number of years. And so, like, even if supposedly political imprisonment is somehow legal, enforced disappearances isn't, and torture isn't. And then all this monitoring and patrolling of like they close websites, the media isn't open. They have shut down like all independent newspapers and TV channels. So like to open up the media space, and I also like to link always freedom to economy and to the well-being. So it's not just freedom of expression. It's like when they have restricted not only all opposition, but all independent thought. For example, like, the Ethiopian Grand Renaissance Dam. So this is like the livelihood, the water that people drink, right? And so like they have even estranged scientists who could propose solutions that would help save people's lives. Like this is, the reason isn't to bring down a dictatorship or anything like that. It's just like to say what the scientific practices should be. And so this has, this freedom, like opening the space, has a direct impact on people's lives of their drinking water. And so, like even just starting with those, of not restricting expression and the file of the prisoners, that would change Egypt's trajectory.
So I've looked at your social media channels. You're quite active. I know you've mentioned British Egyptian human rights activist Allah. I'm not sure what his full name is, but he's been on a hunger strike for quite a while. Do you want to just talk about him and what needs to be done for his release? Because obviously you advocate for political prisoners in Egypt, right?
Yeah, sure. So Alaa Abdel Fattah, he's like one of the most prominent voices that called for the Arab Spring. He and his family, his father was a human rights lawyer, Saif Abdel Fattah. His mother is a mathematician. She teaches at the university. She's also a proponent of free speech. So the father was imprisoned at various times. His sister Sana, was imprisoned also for various times, and the family was beaten just trying to gain access to him and give him letters. So he's been on a hunger strike. There's this terrible practice that Egypt has been doing. Activists call it prison rotation. So while the person is in prison, or like maybe a few days before his or her release or after their release, they're rotated and charged with other crimes that they could not have even committed. So Alaa Abdel Fattah had served his sentence and he was released. He did nothing wrong, and then he was rotated to another case where he had lost prospects of hope. So he was, of course he was innocent, but even according to the law, he served the sentence that he was charged with, and now he was basically, like if there is rule of law, it would be called illegally. And so he's only being punished because he was one of the loudest voices in the Arab Spring, and that's why. And he is a British citizen. I got released because I was an American citizen. The UK should do the same. It's his. If he would have. Well, here, racism and discrimination comes up. Like if he was just a white British-born citizen who's not, a dual citizen, surely they would have had talked more about him. So I do encourage the UK to do what's right for itself. Like even, knowing dual citizens like us who are not white, even. When countries know that they can target us, like in the future, they know, and there's no cost. If the US or UK or whatever government accepted that we be targeted, then they know that it's not that they know that there's a start that they can get away with it. So if it's it's like if the Muslim or the brown or the dual citizen is first, that then after that they will be okay with even non-dual citizens. And so a price must be paid, and the governments must call for their release.
Thank you for that. I'm sure Allah's family will appreciate you calling for his releases. Going back to your imprisonment, your wrongful imprisonment in Egypt, what should the US government be doing better to prevent this from happening to other American citizens? Because I know the US government has established the role of the US Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs, also known as SPIHA. This role is currently performed by Ambassador Roger Carstens. Did your family work with Spihar while you were imprisoned?
No, they weren't, and I think the office there wasn't yet established. I don't know if there's an escalation in the numbers of like hostages that are taken, but I do feel like, especially when it comes to Egyptian dual citizens, that the government kind of has taken a lesson and started advocating for them earlier on. But to the question of what they should be doing is like, not, obviously they shouldn't be leaving prisoners to rot there. There was the case of Mustafa Qasim. I don't know if you've heard about him. He was an American Egyptian, and it was at the Trump White House, Vice President Pence started to get engaged, but Qasim was on a hunger strike, and unfortunately he died. And so while engagement is commendable, a prisoner's life is quite precarious, and so they should intervene way earlier on, at the very first news of the arrest.
All right, thank you for that. And yes, there actually has been an escalation. So there are at least 50 to 60 Americans wrongfully detained or held hostage around the world. In terms of hostage takers, there are two types. There are state actors. These will be countries like Egypt, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, Russia, China, Rwanda. And there are non-state actors like terrorist groups, Somali pirates, for instance. So recently, in the last few years, the number of Americans held hostage abroad by state actors, by other countries, has increased and become a lot higher than the number of Americans held hostage by non-state actors like terrorist groups or Somali pirates. And as you know, it's a lot more complicated to secure the release of a hostage when they're being held by a country as opposed to a terrorist group, because the standard method, or the usual method, which is also an effective deterrent in many ways, is a military operation when the hostage is being held by a terrorist group or Somali pirates. Although I have to say, during military operations, that's when there's the highest risk of that hostage being killed in the crossfire. But at the same point, it still serves as an effective deterrent, because when the hostage takers know that SEAL Team 6 or Delta Force will kick the door down and shoot them in the head, that's a good motivation not to take hostages, especially Americans. And there are only perhaps 4 or 5 countries with elite military operators that have the capability to rescue hostages in this way. But when it comes to countries like Egypt or Iran or Venezuela or Russia or China, that a military operation is not really an option. Some countries might be brave enough or quote unquote reckless enough to try one and risk all-out war. But yes, there has been an escalation in countries taking Americans like yourself hostage. So yeah, I hope the US government does something better. The James W. Foley Foundation has done great work documenting the cases of Americans held hostage and wrongfully detained abroad. So if you're listening and want to find out more, please do check out the great work that the James W. Foley Legacy Foundation do. As we discussed at the beginning, the US government got a lot more involved once the media started to talk about your case a lot more. What can journalists and news editors do to help?
I think journalists and news editors, they also have a role in lifting up the voices. I'm sure, in spaces where the hostage, either himself or herself or through family, have access, to news outlets, they would love to promote their case. And a lot of times, news outlets themselves, they are complicit. And this is not a case that's going to gain traction. Also news outlets do want to sell. And so sometimes there is the duty of doing reporting because it's right, and not only because it's going to sell. And so I think they should go out of their way to either be responsive to the hostages or prisoners or their families, or even reach out to them.
No, I absolutely agree. And you can see this with the case of WNBA superstar Brittney Griner. the media can make more people aware of all these 50 to 60 Americans wrongfully detained or held hostage abroad. But at the moment, the media seems to be focusing on ratings. Not all of them. There are journalists that do great work at CNN, at even Fox News, and other news outlets as well, in raising the cases of individuals held not just in Russia, not just Brittney Griner, but other countries as well. But the problem is the media reports on cases they think the public want to hear about without realizing they have the capability to make the public interested and want to find out more if they just raise awareness of these cases that aren't getting the media attention. So
Yeah,
I've spoken to the other families, right? They know Brittney Griner is getting a lot more attention. And as a result, people are paying more attention to hostage diplomacy, wrongful detentions, and what Americans are doing to bring them home, and the limits of American power abroad, as well as the other cases. But it shouldn't take a celebrity being detained abroad for the media and therefore the government to care a lot more about other Americans wrongfully detained abroad. These other Americans are, some of them are human rights activists. Some of them are military veterans. Actually, quite a few of them are military veterans who served the country, served the United States well. And they're being held abroad, but they're not getting as much media coverage as Brittney Griner. At the same time, I just want to be clear. Brittney Griner should be brought home. She is a victim of hostage diplomacy. It's just the media, I understand, is not just about journalism. They are a business. They need to make money. The more people read or the more people click on an article, the more money they get. I understand that part. But I think that's why I created this podcast, to raise awareness of all these cases, even the ones that aren't covered by the media as much. And I also wanted to interview cases from all around the world to show that this is just not a problem for the UK or the US or Germany or Australia or France. This is a global problem that requires a global solution. It requires countries to come together. So again, I completely agree with your point that the media should not just take the cases that rate well, but all the cases that need help. What can the public do to help? So you got the American public and you got the Egyptian public. The American public has a lot more freedom here because when they speak out, there are less consequences than the Egyptian public speaking out. So what can the public do to help?
So, in mentioning freedom, even signing change.org could be a threat to, not only Egypt, but whatever oppressive country like Iran or probably Russia. But the American public has that. Even in creation of media, media interest in my case happened was when Egyptian public figures actually also spoke about me. And how Egyptian public figures spoke about me was when regular people spoke. So most of us meaning the public, have social media accounts that we use, and now any person can write a tweet that could go viral or grasp attention. And so engaging, paying attention to those issues and engaging with them on social media, talking to their representatives, asking that showing that they care, how regular advocacy happens in all other cases. And also maybe even I do not support one way or another of boycotting a country or not going tourism, but you can raise the profile of a country that's holding hostages or whatnot by writing about it. I am going to go to this country, but I don't appreciate if you are going to go and visit, but I don't appreciate it holding that person, or I'm not going to go because it holds that person. And a lot of those countries, even repressive countries, they do care about their image. And so and they do care especially about their image for Western or Western European or US citizens. So a citizen has leverage, even if they write an article, or if they write on social media that they, a criticism of a country, odds are yes, of course, it's not one person, But when it's more people, like when more people are engaged, like the countries will listen. This is where the dollars are. So like these countries are in bad need of dollars usually.
No, you're absolutely right. You see a lot of this with Saudi Arabia, especially getting celebrities to come over and do stuff. Okay, so the next one is, like you said, about going to countries, right? Should foreigners working in Egypt for international corporations be concerned about being wrongfully detained in the country? And if so, what should these workers and the corporations they work for be doing?
So honestly, like, if they are just like, gas, petroleum, or like technology companies, I don't think that there should be concern. Whenever friends or acquaintances ask me if they should go, I'd say like just keep away from asking questions. Like Egypt has a problem of thinking that everyone asking questions wants to bring it down, or like it's doing it for the sake of espionage. There were instances of like bloggers and like vloggers who talk about food, like who just like film in the streets, have been arrested before. So like while they could go to Egypt and while they could be safe, like any engagement, not only political, but like social, could make them under threat. And of course here, we'd highlight the case of Giulio Regeni, who was a student, he was a researcher, and he was not only killed, but he was also like tortured before he was killed.
No, absolutely. I tell people this when they ask me about hostage diplomacy. Hostage diplomacy doesn't happen to everyone, but it can happen to anyone. So I know I've spoken to many former hostages who were held in Iran, for example, and they thought if they just went to the country, minded their own business, kept their head down and just did their thing, didn't do anything political, they'd be fine. No, they were still arrested. They were at the wrong place at the wrong time, or for the IRGC, the right place at the right time. And they were just detained because they had that American passport or the British passport. And many of these people have traveled to the country before. Brittany Griner has traveled to Russia many times before without being arrested. The people held in Iran, Venezuela, Russia, they've been there before as well. So it's hostage diplomacy doesn't happen to everyone, but it can happen to anyone. And that's why, and the fact that it doesn't happen to everyone is why not enough people seem to care about it at the moment. And that's the problem, because it affects their safety as well. Now, we're almost at the end of our interview. Is there anything else you'd like to mention?
No, I was just going to comment on that of like hostage diplomacy and happening to anyone or everyone. I think it also requires a bit of knowledge on how this, and this is, I don't know how to get that knowledge per se, like how adverse the people and the state are to the U.S. So, for example, Egypt is a U.S. ally, but but there's a very mixed feeling from the state itself and from the people towards Americans. But I've heard like before from lots of Americans who do go and visit other countries, like they'd rather say they're Canadians because they know a lot of people, like not just in the Middle East or authoritarian countries, like even in Europe, have a lot of resentment towards American. And so it might be more dangerous in countries that are like state level and a societal level that have more like adverse and hostile feelings to America, but like rather than, a mixed country like, Egypt or the Middle East. How you would know that, I don't know. But you're right. It could happen to anyone. As like, Regeni probably didn't think he was suspect. I didn't think that I would be targeted. I was just like a regular citizen.
You mentioned Giulio Regeni. So he is, he was sadly a Cambridge University student in the UK. He was an Italian citizen. He went to Egypt to do research about labor unions, and he was found tortured. His body was found tortured, and he'd clearly been murdered. And it's believed that the Egyptian security forces were responsible for this. And to this day, correct me if I'm wrong, no one has been held accountable. And I know Amnesty has called for accountability, because I remember attending a number of demonstrations in front of the Egyptian embassy in London with his colleagues at Cambridge University and with activists calling for accountability. Can you just talk more about Giulio Reggiani's case, please?
Yes, so I learned about Giulio Reggiani when I was in prison myself, and it was at the eve of January 25th. Can't remember which year now, but it's it used to be, at least like in the first years of Sisi's rules, that he would pay very close attention on the January 25th because it's the memory of the revolution. And this was, I think, like January 25 or January 26th that his body was found. And this is very unusual because he's also like a white, European citizen, and white European or Americans have largely been immune. We've had trials before of also the American white European Americans who have been in nonprofits, and they've been deported without even arrest and without standing in trial. So this was shocking to everyone that he was treated as an Egyptian. Egypt has tried to cover it up, and in its attempt, they have murdered 5, I believe, innocent Egyptians whom the Egyptian media invented that there was a crime, that there was a gang that would target foreigners, and they made fake IDs, and they just killed all 5 people. But then when people didn't buy it, even the layman in the streets wouldn't buy it, they started doing investigations. And I didn't follow closely afterwards, but I know Italy and Egypt have went back and forth with asking for evidence and for and in submitting evidence. And Egypt, I think, was willing to implicate junior officers' involvements, but I don't believe that there were any arrests in the case. And I know that people who were paying attention to the case, what we know is that it wasn't junior officers who were involved. It was right up to the highest level.
We're so sorry for Giulio Reggiani and his family, and our thoughts with them. And we hope that they get the accountability they deserve, and this doesn't happen again. Yes. I mean, there's not really much I can say, or I don't really know what to say. I said this at the beginning of this episode, and I'll say it again. I'm so happy that you're free and back home in the United States. You seem to be happy and doing quite well, which gives hope to other hostages and their families that things will get better. Thanks for taking the time to speak to us today.
Thank you, Darren, and big words of encouragement for any families or hostages who may be listening.
Thank you for listening to Pod Hostage Diplomacy. Thank you for giving your time and for showing these families that they're not alone, that there are good, caring people out there willing to stand by their side and help in any way possible.
Because if enough people care, then the right people will care enough. This is sort of a basic rule of thumb that is true for all campaigning.
If you haven't already, please subscribe to our fortnightly newsletter called The Hostage Briefing. It's the best way to keep up to date with the cases we're working on, as well as new episodes. You can subscribe to this newsletter using the link in the description of this podcast episode that you're currently listening to. Thanks again, and take care.